Hi, and welcome to chapter 21. This chapter, we're going to learn all about how populations evolve. And of course, as usual, I've broken it down into several parts. Part 1, we're going to learn about how variation is absolutely necessary for evolution to occur. All right, so one really common misconception, and I've talked to you about this in the previous lecture, is that a lot of people think that individual organisms evolve, and they don't. Natural selection acts on individuals, but it's only the population that can evolve. While individuals might change over their lifetime, in biology, we don't consider that evolution. We consider that development. So if you're going to talk about evolution, you have to understand how a population changes over time. So an example here, I'm showing you a ground finch, and this ground finch is found on one of the Galapagos Islands called Daphne major. And this ground finch has been studied ever since the 1970s, so a really long time. And what we see, what the researchers have found, is that the beak size has evolved in the population of these finches. What happened in the 1970s that was so really interesting is that a drought occurred. And of the 1,200 birds that were on the island before the drought, only 180 of them survived. And part of the reason for this, one of the major reasons for this is because the seeds were just not available. The bushes and trees were not producing as many seeds. Now, the seeds that were able to be produced or survive from year to year with this drought were large seeds that were very hard. So the seeds were large and hard, and only birds that were able to take advantage of those seeds were able to find food. So birds with larger beaks were the ones that were able to feed on those large, hard seeds. So if you have a big beak, deeper, larger beak, you have food. And if you have food, then you will survive. And if you survive, then you're likely to pass that trait that you have on to your offspring. So in 1976, the beak size was, this is in millimeters, just under 9 millimeters. This is the depth of the beak. And after the drought, which happened in 1977, after the drought, the average beak depth was well over 9.5 millimeters. So getting close to 10 millimeters. Again, the beak depth changed in the population, not because individuals grew bigger beaks. They didn't. What happened was the birds with smaller beaks were less likely to survive to reproduce. And the ones with larger beaks were more likely to survive to reproduce and pass on that trait. So the population evolved, not its individual members. We often talk in this class about evolution, and when we talk about evolution, we really tend to think about new species evolving. And that's true. Part of evolution is the idea of new species evolving. But that's not the definition of evolution. So we do, remember, evolution is just change in the population. So we do tend to break down evolution from microevolution and comparing that to macroevolution. Macroevolution, that means big evolution, right? That would be the formation of new species. But microevolution is change in allele frequencies in a population over time, usually over generations. So it's not that those are two different processes. They're the exact same process. It's just that the axis of time, how long of time has gone by or how large the changes are. That's the only difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Macroevolution leads to new species. Microevolution, if given enough time, will become macroevolution and can lead to new species. But again, that's not the definition of evolution. It's just change in allele frequencies in a population. There are three main mechanisms for that cause allele frequency change, and we have already talked about one of them fairly extensively. We're going to talk about it again. That's natural selection. There's a couple other things that are involved here, like genetic drift and gene flow. And we'll get some definitions of those later, actually fairly soon. But only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. Another way to say that is, if natural selection is occurring, then you can have adaptation. If the other ones are occurring, then you're not likely to be getting adaptation. Now remember, this part of the lecture is mostly about genetic variation and how genetic variation makes evolution possible. So variation in a heritable trait, again, heritable just means being able to be passed down, it's genetic, is absolutely required for evolution by natural selection. It's actually required for any kind of evolution, because remember that evolution is change in allele frequency. So if the genetics are all the same, then you can't have any change. And just a quick reminder that it was Mendel's work on pea plants that did provide us with information about how those traits are inherited. We often substitute the idea of phenotypic variation for genetic variation simply because it's easier to see, right? In order to look at genetic variation, you have to look at the DNA, or you have to look at the different proteins. So that's a little bit harder. But remember that DNA leads to RNA, and RNA leads to proteins, and proteins influence the phenotype. So we do use phenotypic variation to reflect genetic variation. And genetic variation just is differences in, genes, DNA sequences, those kinds of things. So that makes sense. Some phenotypic differences can be classified as either or. Remember when we were studying Mendel, we had either green or yellow, right? When we were doing those labs. It was true for every trait that Mendel studied. But usually, that's very common, those kinds of traits are determined by a single gene. But frequently, when we're thinking about phenotype, we are thinking about, and we're looking at the influences of many genes, and this kind of gradation and variation along this continuum, like you see in these horses. They go from a dark horse with a dark mane, like you see here, to a light horse with a light mane that you see here, and there's all kinds of gradations in between. Again, that's still inheritable. It's still a heritable genetic characteristic. It's just that there's more than one gene that goes into it. To keep things fairly simple, though, as we're going to go through this, we are going to tend to focus, just like we did with Mendel, on the genes that are more straightforward. But that doesn't mean that other types of genes can't evolve. Of course they can. Genetic variation, again, happens at the gene level. So one of the things that we can kind of quantify, we can actually do some math on, is the average percentage of loci that exist in your entire genome that are heterozygous. So genetic variation can be measured we can measure like heterozygosity, like how much is heterozygous among all the genes in a population. And we can also measure these at the molecular level. Like we can look at individual nucleotide variability. So again, whole gene level or the nucleotide level are different ways to measure genetic variation. One thing to keep in mind about that nucleotide variation is that it doesn't often result in phenotypic variation. Most of the differences in nucleotide variation do occur in those non-coding regions, for example, the introns. So that's important to remember because you might see variation at that nucleotide level that's not reflected in the phenotype. Variations that occur in coding regions, remember those are called exons, rarely affect the protein sequence of amino acids, because remember that redundancy that exists in the table of codons, right? The genetic code. There's all that redundancy, but also remember that a lot of times when you substitute a new amino acid in, that can have seriously detrimental effects. So that doesn't really necessarily, even if you have mutations, it doesn't necessarily affect the phenotype. And it really is the phenotype that's being selected on by natural selection. It's also possible that a phenotypic variation is not due to a genetic difference. You could think about it in humans. In the wintertime, maybe your skin is a little bit lighter in color. In the summertime, if you spend time outside, your skin might be a little darker in color. That variation is due to the environment only, so that's not going to be passed on. Phenotype is the product of both genotype and environment, so we kind of have to keep that in mind as we're measuring traits. Also, it's important that natural selection can act on phenotypic variation, but it only passes on, that successful trait only passes on if it has a genetic component to it. Now, this is a little bit of a review. Genetics is, of course, absolutely important, and when you have a new allele, right, through mutation, this could also happen through gene duplication. It could also happen through crossing over, right? So genetic variation is introduced in these ways that we've already talked about. And of course, that crossing over idea, that happens in sexual reproduction. And so we have new combinations of alleles. They occur in different ways than they had before. So that's just an important little review there. We're going to just spend a little bit more time on mutation because it is an important concept. And so new alleles can arise by mutation. It doesn't always happen. Every mutation that happens in the DNA doesn't always give you a new allele. Remember that alleles are expressed. They're expressed in the protein, so not all DNA gets expressed into a protein. So again, just as a reminder that mutations can be caused by errors in DNA replication. It can be caused by exposure to high energy radiation, and it can be caused by exposure to certain chemicals that are called mutagens, or carcinogens, for example. So that would be reasons or causes for new alleles to form. Just also remember that the first one that I mentioned, this DNA replication one, that happens in every living organism. Every time a new cell is made, DNA replication happens. So you got a chance of having mutations develop every single time you have DNA replicating. But also remember that there's ways of fixing that. And so fixes happen exactly as we've discussed them before. Point mutations are those single nucleotide changes in the DNA sequence, and they don't always have big harmful impacts. But if they do, if a mutation is harmful, then that's not going to survive. It's not going to get passed on very easily. But mutant alleles can actually improve an organism's reproductive success, especially if it happens to just occur in the right environment. So it's not like all mutations are bad. Some mutations are good, or at least neutral, and that's important to keep in mind. Mutations in non-coding regions result in neutral variation. All that means is that if there's a difference, it might not give you an advantage or a disadvantage in natural selection. A neutral mutation can can arise in a coding region, especially if there's some sort of redundancy. So this diagram right here just kind of summarizes the things that we've talked about. We've talked about harmful mutations and beneficial mutations, and now we've talked about neutral mutations. So those are the three that like evolution would act upon. For harmful mutations, evolution would act to decrease their abundance in a population. For beneficial mutations, natural selection would act to increase the presence in the population. And then for neutral mutations, it wouldn't have either an increase or decrease effect. It would just be neutral. Any mutation that deletes a region of a chromosome or disrupts a gene, or even if it duplicates a gene, remember we talked about gene duplication before, where the entire gene is repeated, or even rearranging translocation of genes. These are typically harmful. But interestingly, gene duplication, especially of small chromosome segments, may not be harmful and actually can be helpful. They can persist for many generations. So if this duplicated gene isn't harmful and it's accumulating over many generations, it's possible that each section of the duplication, like we'll call this the duplication part 1, and that's the second part. We don't know which section was duplicated, but of course we have a duplication there. Maybe they mutate in different ways. And if they're mutating in different ways, then this can take on a slightly different function. And that is something that has happened repeatedly in evolutionary history. So one of the things that we know is that there's an interesting gene duplication in the smell or scent organs of mammals. And so humans and mice have literally hundreds of copies of this odor detecting gene that enables us to distinguish between many, many different smells. So hundreds of copies of a gene, hundreds of duplications. So each version of that allows us to detect different scents. And that's been an evolutionary advantage for the mammals. Another thing that is important when it comes to variation is that that mutation rates interact with reproduction. What do I mean by this? So let's start out by talking about the mutation rate in animals and plants. We would say that generally speaking, the mutation rate is low in animals and plants. And on average, we're talking about 1 in every 10,000 genes per generation. And again, generation can mean, depending on you're talking about mitosis or meiosis, generation can mean in mitosis, it can happen every couple of weeks. But when we're talking meiosis, and that's really the important thing here for evolution, 1 in every 100,000 genes per generation have an offspring. It is actually slower in prokaryotes, right? Bacteria and archaea, the mutation rate is slower, but because generation times are so quick, remember that in prokaryotes, it can be as fast as every 20 minutes, that we see a rapid accumulation of genetic variation, even though mutation rates are pretty slow. In viruses, and remember viruses aren't alive, and I am showing you a picture of this coronavirus right here. Viruses do mutate, especially if they have RNA genomes like the coronavirus that's going around. So their genome, it can't be repaired by the host cells. So just a quick reminder that that viruses are not considered to be alive because they don't have their own repair. They don't do their own metabolism. So the host cells aren't repairing the RNA for the viruses. And so viruses do accumulate mutations very rapidly, and they also reproduce very, very quickly. So lots and lots of mutation in viruses. Last but not least, let's talk about how sexual reproduction actually increases variability among the offspring. This is a reminder. Hopefully you remember this from the chapter that we covered on meiosis. So we do get increased variation with sexual reproduction due to crossing over, right? That's where you get the new combination of alleles. And then with independent assortment, that's like there's different ways that chromosomes can align in metaphase. And depending on how they align in metaphase, the gametes can have different combinations in those gametes. So that's independent assortment adding to variation, right? Because they're not always ending up with the same type of gamete. And then, of course, random fertilization. This is our good old Punnett square. And, depending on which genotype you have and which genotype the other person in the mating has, fertilization could happen in any one of these 4 ways. So that's my basic summary here for you of how variation is necessary and is created in the process that later the processes of evolution will act upon. And we'll learn about that as we get into part 2, where we learn a little bit of math so we can understand evolution a little bit better.